One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in darkness bind them. My wedding vows.
Oh, sexy.
Welcome to This Is Lit, a podcast where we drink and talk about our favorite books. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Casey.
So raise a glass and let's get started.
Okay, Liz, what are you drinking today?
I am drinking vodka diet. Mostly vodka with a splash of diet. Because as anyone who's been following up with us knows, our lives have been straight up turned upside down and I am still dealing with it.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm drinking vodka also. Grapefruit vodka.
Cheers.
It's just grapefruit vodka.
Yeah. Casey is a true connoisseur. They don't need a mixer.
Mixers are overrated.
Completely.
So today we are discussing the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring. It was published in 1954, I think.
I have a very pretty version. This was a wedding anniversary gift from my husband. I have the whole set.
Yeah. So it was published in 1954 by JRR Tolkien. It's a follow-up to his 1937 novel, The Hobbit, which is actually the first episode of our podcast about The Hobbit.
Don't go listen to it. It's terrible.
Audio quality suffered a little bit.
Well, we're quite persnicket.
Yeah. Well, that's the point.
Yes.
Anywho, he wrote The Hobbit for his children, and he wrote the Lord of the Rings as a request to continue the story from his son, Christopher. And also because he is a linguist and he wanted an excuse to write more fantasy languages. So it's an epic high fantasy novel. Everybody knows it. I don't know why I'm sitting here telling you. You know what Lord of the Rings is. Even if you haven't read it, you've probably seen the Oscar-winning films. And even if you haven't seen them, you're familiar with the concept. But sometimes you got to do a book that everybody knows because you're too emotionally and mentally drained to read anything new.
Yeah, and also too, this is an infinite number of rereads for us. I don't know what number this is because I've lost count how many times I've read this.
Yeah. When was the first time you read it?
The first time I read it was in middle school. I was 7th grade, so that was what, 13?
Yeah, thereabouts.
The movies were about to come out, so I wanted to
read it before the movies came out.
To read it before the movies came out.
Yeah,
and then I fell in love with Aragorn.
Yeah, the first movie came out in 2001, and I read it slightly before that. I read it in 5th grade, so I read them in 2000. I read The Hobbit and all 3 Lord of the Rings books basically back to back. Mm-hmm. It was one of my special interests whenever I was in middle school and late elementary school with my ADHD. Sometimes I get really, really hyper fixated on something. And when I was in middle school, it was Lord of the Rings. I actually got told I wasn't allowed to talk if I was going to talk about Lord of the Rings on a couple of occasions, just because I was too over enthusiastic about it.
You do not need that kind of negativity in your life, dear.
But
I'll happily listen to you talk about Lord of the Rings.
Luckily, we're here because we're about to do it for an hour. At least. Yes. So the first Lord of the Rings novel, like I said, was really just his attempt to follow up on The Hobbit. And he didn't, it's interesting because I don't know if this was the standard procedure for the time or if it's just happened to be how Tolkien decided to do it. But he had completed the series before he started publishing, with the exception, The Hobbit, he wrote The Hobbit in 1937. His son asked for more. And so he wrote the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy as a 6-part series. And the whole thing was finished before he started publishing, as opposed to nowadays. I mean, we've got George R.R. Martin, who's another epic fantasy writer who is still working on books in his series, in the Ice and Fire series. But Tolkien completed them before he started publishing, and they started publishing to pretty popular reviews in the late 50s. But they didn't really kick off in society until the mid-70s. When the counterculture movement was happening. Lord of the Rings deals pretty heavily with war, but it's not a positive picture. It doesn't picture war positively.
It's a very realistic picture of
Well,
war,
Tolkien
even in
was
a fantasy setting.
Well, Tolkien was a veteran.
He was.
He was a war veteran. He fought in the First World War. And so he really uses war as a necessary evil. And he really uses it as a backdrop for writing his characters. And that really appealed to people in the 70s because it was the counterculture movement and make love, not war, like a bunch of peaceful protesters. This is the time period whenever it really kicked off and like became very, very popular. Think about like Harry Potter in the early 2000s. Like people writing Frodo lives in the New York subway system and graffiti. That's when it really took off. And after that, it got a couple of animated movies, and it had been in development hell for years and years and years before Peter Jackson.
Have you seen the animated Lord of the Rings?
Oh yeah, I have. Of course I have.
It is the most hilarious thing.
It's pretty good.
Aragorn doesn't wear pants.
Just got them Robin Hood leggings, you know?
Yeah, he's got them Robin Hood legs.
But yeah, so Lord of the Rings, published 1954, really blew up in the 70s, and then in development hell for years and years, and then in 2001, Peter Jackson finally brought us the original trilogy. Unfortunately, the Hobbit trilogy came later.
Well, the original Lord of the Rings trilogy was filmed all at once, and the studio was like, yeah, we'll give you the money to make this, but we don't think it's going to be a hit. We don't think it's, and like you can tell in the editing as the movies got bigger and bigger and bigger with the populace, since there was a year between their releases, the CGI budget got bigger as things went on. And so then if anybody doesn't know, since he's like, yeah, I'll do The Hobbit, I'll make it 2 movies, the studio kind of left Peter Jackson alone for the first Lord of the Rings trilogy. Mm-hmm. And then when they were doing The Hobbit, they realized, oh, this is going to make money for us. And so they became far more involved than they really should have been.
Well, and there was too much CG. Frankly, they used a lot of practical effects in the original trilogy. And I think The Hobbit suffered for the CG, but that's neither here nor there.
No,
that has nothing to do with anything. I was just trying to give a framework of the popularity of Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, like I said, exceedingly popular to this day. The third one was the first fantasy film to win Best Picture, and it also held the record for a while for most number of Oscars. The movie got 11 Oscars.
Or 17. No, it was nominated.
It was nominated for 17. It won 11.
Yeah.
Which was the record at the time. It broke Titanic's record. It's been broken now, but in 2003, that was a big deal because blockbusters and fantasy films didn't often win Oscars.
No.
But even now, they're talking about doing an Amazon series, a limited series of
which, even if it's terrible, I will still watch.
Well, yeah. So the point is, it's a very popular story. You know the story. So rather than go through the plot blow by blow, I think we should just like pop into a couple of spots that maybe are not in the films and discuss more of the themes of the book and analyze the literature rather than just giving you the whole summary, because you probably already know it.
Yeah. And even if you don't think you know Lord of the Rings, you actually do, because Tolkien basically created high fantasy with these books. Orcs did not exist before he wrote. D&D is based heavily on this. So any kind of like D&D podcast you listen to, Dads and Dice, Critical Role, any kind of that, the McElroys would not exist without Tolkien.
Yeah. Tolkien did pretty much single-handedly invent the genre. He did have some contemporaries who were working at the same time. The Inklings was his writing group at Oxford.
Yes, which also included C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Right, and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was another one of the contemporaries. The difference being that Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was really a children's novel. We kind of talked about this when we did Wrinkle in Time. Children's fantasy has been around longer than adult fantasy. It was always okay to have dragons and princesses in children's novels, but Tolkien was the first one who really gave it a grittier, I hate to use the word gritty, but you know what I mean, a grittier, like more realistic backdrop and more adult themes.
Because with fantasy, it was acceptable to kind of introduce very adult themes and ideas, but since it was fantasy, it was considered for children.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a lot easier to hide some of those moral lessons and themes in a fantasy book for children than it would be in a realistic book for children.
Right. So Tolkien, yeah, like Liz said, Tolkien really did kind of create the genre of adult speculative fantasy, and a lot of the things we have nowadays, D&D, like Liz said, which was, I think, started in the late 70s, early 80s, very much followed on the footsteps of this Lord of the Rings mania, and so did George R.R. Martin, which paved the way for high fantasy on television. So it was a very influential piece of work, obviously. And like I said,
in Stranger Things.
Yes, which of course Stranger Things, leans heavily on the D&D concept, so that's not surprising. But at its heart, it's very much just a hero's journey story.
It is.
As you know, the story is the story of a hobbit called Frodo Baggins, who carries an evil ring from his home in the Shire to Mordor, the land where it was created, to a volcano, which is the only place it can be destroyed, in order to essentially save the world. The thing that's so funny about these books is Tolkien was a literature professor, very practical man, very analytically minded, and so there's a lot of emphasis on the history and the languages, even though it is a fantasy story for enjoyment purposes.
Yes.
Tolkien was really focused on creating a whole cloth world. He actually got into it with his publisher at the very beginning because he wanted to publish it as 2 tomes, one which was all 3 of the books, and one which was the Silmarillion, which is the histories of the elves.
Yes.
His publishers did not want to do that because that was not good for business.
The Silmarillion is, if you believe in yourself, you and your elf family can screw up everything for everyone if you try hard enough.
But eventually it became what we know, which is 3 novels, each which are split into 2 books. The first one being The Fellowship of the Ring, which we're discussing today. Eventually, I know we've been talking for like 20 minutes and we're just now getting to that. Like I said, we're not going to really focus heavily on the plot, but I would like to talk about some plot details that are different between the book and the movie, I think.
Yes. First kind of plot point is that I kind of really see a difference in is that the time between Gandalf discovering that Bilbo's magic ring is the One Ring at the party and then the time he comes back to the Shire is like 15 years. It's not, and the movie makes it look like it's like one thing happens right after the other. In the book, Frodo is almost 50, which hobbits do not mature until they're 33.
Yeah, he said it's 17. It's a 17-year gap
17
between Bilbo's 111th birthday, whenever he vanishes and leaves the ring to Frodo, and whenever Frodo sets out on his journey. There's 17 years in between. Of course, for the movie, they have to cut that down because it doesn't pace well. But also, to me, it doesn't super pace well in the book.
No.
Again, I think this is a case of Tolkien being more analytical and realistic, because logically, if Gandalf is traveling across the entire country or the entire world,
it makes sense. And also, too, it's very kind of in line with the timeline of something like the Odyssey or Beowulf, which we know he was a big...
Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is another one of his big... He actually did a translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight later on in his career. But yeah, so it does fit into that epic mythology, which is the closest thing we had to high fantasy before we had high fantasy.
Yes.
But as far as pacing goes, it just seems wild that someone's like, here, you now have a handheld nuclear bomb. Just sit tight for almost 20 years.
Tell no one you have this thing.
Tell no one you have this. Just stay at home and mind your business for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
And admittedly, it's different for hobbits than for humans, because 20 years is a lot longer for a human than a hobbit.
Yeah.
But a hobbit's not immortal. They're not an elf. They still age. And so Frodo is 50 years old when he finally takes off on his journey. And
Bilbo was.
At the same age that Bilbo was when he left in The Hobbit. And he takes his friends with him. He tells them that he is moving house.
Yeah, he's moving from Hobbiton to Brandybuck.
Yes.
So he's like, I'm just moving. I'm selling the house. I'm giving it to Lobelia Sackville Baggins. And I'm moving. And what he doesn't, so he takes his loyal friend, Samwise Gamgee, and tells his cousins, Mary Doc, Brandybuck, and Pippin Took, Peregrine, my mistake, Peregrine Took, that, Merry and Pippin, that he's actually leaving the Shire forever. And they're like, and he's like, I have to go to Bree and Rivendell. And they're like, well, we'll come with you.
Well, the thing is, they know. They already know.
They know.
They've been spying on him.
Yeah.
They've been spying on him, and they've already decided that he's not going to go without them, which is the first, the first time we really see the theme of friendship within the novels crop up. Like friendship, even whenever you're resistant to help. And it's kind of that theme of like, your friends will help you even if you don't ask for it. Yeah. They'll know that you need it. Like, you should always ask for help. Don't get that wrong. But the theme here that you're going to see recurring over and over again in the trilogy is that your friends will be there for you to help you even if you're not willing to ask for help.
Yeah, and the reason Frodo, his character, is not really willing to ask for a lot of help is because he cares about these people, and he's like, this is my problem. I don't want to put them in any more danger than they're already in.
Right.
It's a very reluctant hero kind of trope.
Right, and at this point, Frodo thinks he is going to take the ring to Rivendell and be done. He thinks that he'll get it to Rivendell, and then he will go home. Yeah. So he's already on an adventure, but it's not quite, the scope of the adventure is not quite sunk in with it yet.
No. The scope has not quite been established. He doesn't understand the power of the thing he carries, which it plays to his benefit.
Yes. Yeah, he is, the thing that's interesting is that the ring it's kind of a very heavy-handed metaphor for power in general.
It is.
You hear the power corrupts absolutely. The ring itself is a incredibly powerful magical item, and everyone who carries it is warped and changed by it in a negative fashion. However, for whatever reason, hobbits seem a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? They seem a little less prone to that corruption. Hobbits don't really, as a race, don't really have any interest in adventure. They're have pretty humble needs and desires.
Yeah, they're interested in food, wine, friendship, their garden. They're very humble creatures.
Hobbits are basically, and this is one of those things that I'm going to get into that we've gotten into before.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien's worst habit in these books is you can very clearly see the delineation of who he is picturing in reality when he describes certain races.
Well,
the hobbits are very much good old British country folk.
They are good old British country folk.
British country folk, that's very, very clearly where he drew those parallels from these humble people who live in small villages around England, which is fine. That's fine.
He has said anyone who wants trouble with it, that he sees as an orc. It doesn't matter. He has said that like anyone who wants to kind of destroy nature, put it on the back burner for the sake of industrialization, is someone who is orcish in his view.
But the orcs are a race.
Yeah, they are, but they originally started out as elves who chose to do evil. So, description-wise, yes, I'm with you. But
also
I feel like there are some arguments that can be made.
Also taking into account the fact that they have to go to the Far East to get rid of the ring, and in the Far East all of the characters are slant-eyed and swarthy-skinned, and
I am with you there. That one's pretty racist.
the orcs, the goblins, and this is a problem fantasy has in general. And again, since Tolkien is kind of the founder of the genre, he bears the brunt of the responsibility for this. But fantasy has a tendency to be like, everyone of X race is good or bad. And we're seeing some movement away from that more recently. I think of there's a show on Netflix called The Dragon Prince. I haven't watched all of it yet, but we've watched some of it, and the main two groups in it are the Sun Elves and the Night Elves. And the Sun Elves tell everybody that the Night Elves are all evil, but like at the very beginning, a Night Elf joins a couple of Sun Elves on a quest, and they're working together, and it starts to become clear that there's misunderstandings between their culture have more to do with it. And
the first series I saw first majorly wildly popular series I saw do something like that was Avatar: The Last Airbender. Because like we're led to like, oh, the Fire Nation is evil, everyone in the Fire Nation is evil. It's like, no, they're just a repressed kingdom that has absolutely no say in what's going on in their lives right now.
Evil leader, yeah. So modern fantasy is starting to get away from that, but it still falls into it all the time. We've actually talked about this in our D&D group about, instead of building your character based on race, building them based more around the storyline of the character. Because races in D&D are given standard alignments.
Yeah.
Like a character can be of any alignment, but if you look in the D&D book at orcs, it will say chaotic evil.
And see,
and that's just assigning all orcs to chaotic evil is just like not
ridiculous. Especially since the first example of an orc I think of is from the Taz Balance arc, Killian. And she is wonderful.
Well, that's the nice thing about D&D is that players can take charge of that narrative. But that doesn't help, like when you're writing your own, whenever you're doing a campaign, you have a situation where it's like I mean, my players that I DM just went through last Monday. They went through a drow cavern and just absolutely just wrecked house on these drows who were like all up there into torture and like masochism, like, or sadism and shit like that. And like they just like tore through them, and like that's what the game intended for them to do.
Yeah.
Because it's like, yeah, drow are bad. And it's like, that's bad enough to be like an entire race is bad, but it's worse whenever you take into account how those races, especially Tolkien's races, are described physically.
In the book, it's not super obvious, but when you watch it in the movies, it is super obvious because all of the orcs have dark skin. That's why, like, the Uruk-hai, they have, like, the white hand on them, and it's like, I wonder if they did that from a design standpoint so aesthetically the white hand would show up better on camera, but I doubt it. You know what I mean?
I'm interested in changing things as we go forward. But at any rate, we haven't even gotten to orcs yet. They leave. Frodo is forced to bring his friends with him. They will not let him go.
No.
And he expects to meet Gandalf in Bree, which is a human village fairly near to the Shire.
Yeah, the border of the Shire. And things go awry. And then this is the person we meet that everybody who has read the books loves, but anybody who has watched the movies has absolutely no idea about. Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil. It's basically a self-insert.
So they meet Tom Bombadil before
they even get to Bree.
Yes, because there is an area called the Barrow Downs.
Yes, it's
in between the Shire and Bree. It's a bunch of ancient burial grounds.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, because this is a fantasy novel, the ancient burial grounds are full of horrible ghosty monsters, like rites.
Yes.
So there's these like
it drives them off.
So they are rescued by a man called Tom Bombadil, who is the quintessential like kind of English folk hero.
Yeah, he's
he's kind of like a Johnny Appleseed type. is what I think of for American folk heroes. He makes me think of Johnny Appleseed or Paul Bunyan. Like, it's in that same family of characters. Yeah. He's called the eldest.
Yeah, the eldest.
Tolkien, it's fascinating with Tolkien because Tolkien has appendices for everything.
He does.
So like, we know the history of, Frodo's mother's mother.
Yeah.
But sometimes he just decides not to say anything.
Yeah.
And Tom Bombadil.
Nothing else about Tom Bombadil.
He's called the oldest, which kind of indicates that he was there before anybody else was.
Yeah.
So then you're like, is he the first person? Is he God? Is he a human? Unclear. He looks like a human.
There is a theory that Tom Bombadil is the JRR Tolkien self-inserts character into this book.
Yeah.
Which I can definitely see. I read that theory and then reread this book again and was like, oh yeah, see it now.
Yeah. So Bombadil takes them to his house, and the whole time they're trying to keep secret that they have this superpowered ring with them. But again, he's
like, oh, I know, you can keep it. I don't care. I don't want it.
He seems to be the only person in the entire series who has no interest in it. It also does not work on him. The most basic power that the ring has is that when someone puts it on, it turns them invisible.
Yeah.
It does not do that to Tom Bombadil. He not only takes the ring and tries it on, but he gives it back without any problem, which is the only time we ever see a character do this.
Yeah. He's the only person, well, it's not the only time that somebody relinquishes the ring, but it is the first time.
Yeah, it's the only time someone relinquishes the ring too without any kind of strife whatsoever.
That's true.
There are people throughout the series. I mean, obviously Bilbo relinquished the ring to Gandalf to give to Frodo. Well, Gandalf didn't even touch it. He gave Bilbo an envelope to put it in because he didn't want to touch it. Because there's also a certain element.
What it was.
Well, the issue is the reason that hobbits are such an ideal carrier for the ring is because, again, they're very humble, but also they don't have any power.
Yeah.
They don't have any magical power. They don't have any strong physical power. But the more power you have, the more intensely the ring seems to corrupt you.
Well, and also, too, the ring plays off your desires.
Mm-hmm.
And all hobbits desire are, tanker of beer, full belly, and a nice fire and a pipe. They don't desire a whole lot. Whereas somebody who is in a powerful position, who is like a king of a country, who desires to protect said country, is a lot.
Well, Gandalf is basically a minor deity.
Yeah, he's basically an angel.
If you read into the more deep lore, he's what's called the Maiar, which are basically minor deities. They're like a tier down from the Valar, which are the ones who created the universe.
Yeah, and they were sent to Middle Earth to protect it.
There's 5 of them.
Yes.
5. There's the 2 blue ones, Radagast, the brown,
Saruman, and Gandalf.
Anyway, we're getting really way too deep in the lore. We're going full Stephen Colbert over here.
You cannot talk about this book without getting into the lore, because the lore is so deep and so pervasive, and so much of the story of the Lord of the Rings, you do get the idea that, the Third Age is after. You get so much of the idea that, like, the First and the Second Age were great ages, and now the Third Age is just kind of like, this is just the way things are now. Like, the First Age was amazing, and then the Second Age is when, like, all the war and destruction happened, and then the Third Age is what happened after. So there's already a huge sense of history in Lord of the Rings, because there were 2 ages that they have to refer to. Like, even when they get to the Aragorn app, which is way at the end, you still get, there's all this sense of history that they're having to also take into account for this plot to work. So it's a very deep world building.
Yes. Yeah, it's a lot of world building. The book itself, like, I love Lord of the Rings, but, like, frankly, I think it's valid when people are like, I don't care for this book, because it's very, very wordy, and, like, it'll just go off.
You read about trees.
Yeah, it'll go off on a tangent for like 10 pages about, like,
trees,
the trees, or like a village, and you're like, okay, I guess I'm here now. And that's not everybody's cup of tea. But the story that's within it is very good. And like to me, the world building makes it more interesting. But not everybody is super interested in world building.
And there's also another thing that lends to the sense of history just in this story is all the folk songs, all the legends that are brought up to Frodo.
My God, there are 10, 11 page long songs. Just like in the book. It's just like all of a sudden you're like, here's a wall of text. It's all in italics.
Yeah.
It's a song.
The Ballad of Baron and Luthien.
But again, this is the way that in real life, this is the way that history was passed down.
Yes.
Before we had ways to record it, before we had a written language, before we had, video recorders and things. You pass down stories through song because it made it easier to remember.
Yeah.
That's what the Odyssey is essentially supposed to be. And this again plays very heavily off of that idea. So we get these long drawn out songs, which a lot of them got cut from the movies. There were a few that were kept, but for the most part they got cut because Tolkien wrote the words for the songs, the lyrics for these songs, but there's no tunes, and they take up so much time and space that they would just absolutely weigh down a film.
They're in the extended editions.
Some of them are, not all of them.
Not all of them. But I know one of the reasons this book is sometimes the language is so clunky is because Tolkien wrote this as if it was a translation from an ancient text. So that's why we do get references to angels, even though there's no Christianity in this world. And that's also why we get references to things like Christmas trees, where it's like the person who is translating this ancient text is translating it into something that the modern person can understand and not necessarily the literal translation. So that's why sometimes we get these big, long descriptive things and then we get something about, yeah.
At the heart, Tolkien is a linguist.
He is.
And he wanted to spend time writing languages and building a world for those languages to exist in. So to him, a lot of times it feels like the actual driving plot is an afterthought.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in a bad way, but it's sometimes wild how you'll have this context for something that happened 600 years ago, but you won't know anything about the character that the protagonist is talking to in the moment.
Yeah, he even says it himself in the prologue. This story grew in the telling.
Yes, there is a prologue, which is not necessary to read if you've read The Hobbit, but it is helpful if you haven't.
It's a prologue that explains hobbits.
Basically, yeah. But at any rate, the hobbits have now traveled to Bree, stopping at Tom Bombadil and his wife Goldberry's house for a short stay, which was a very pleasant few chapters to me. Yes. I really liked them. A lot of people who read it really liked it.
And they escape a creature that's similar to something like a will-o'-the-wisp.
Yeah. Yeah. So they end up in Bree, where they're supposed to meet Gandalf, and the innkeeper tells them that he hasn't seen Gandalf in literal years, which is the first indication that Frodo gets that this journey is going to be more than he anticipated. At this point, he thought, I'll go to Bree, and Gandalf will handle it from there. He gets to Bree, Gandalf's not there, and he's like, okay, so apparently I'm not done with this adventure yet. And that's where they meet Strider.
Yes. Who... I'm trying to find his literary entrance because it literally in the movies it looked like it was ripped from the book and put directly into the movie, and it was perfection.
They did a very, very good job with it. Yes,
they did. Basically, a stranger is sitting in a dark corner. You can't see anything but his eyes because of the pipe, and his feet are up on a table.
He seems very threatening at first.
He does. He seems exceptionally threatening.
He's also. It doesn't help. It doesn't help that he's a little bit aggressive and seems to be not very good at talking to other people.
No, he's been out in the wild a little bit too long.
Yeah. The thing about Aragorn, because of course Strider is Aragorn. The thing about Aragorn as a character is he can be multiple different things as the narrative needs him to be.
Yes. He can be a drifter. He can be a leader. He can be a medicine man.
But at the moment, he's really just this strange drifter that these hobbits don't know.
Yes.
Who's much more well armed than they are, and seems to be aware that they're carrying something of high value. So to them, he is a threat.
Yeah.
Then he saves their lives.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we should listen to you, because he says, "I am a friend of Gandalf. I'm getting you to Rivendell."
Yes. So at this point, they've also been being chased. The villain, the antagonist of the series, Sauron, the one who created the ring, very Voldemort-y, used to have.
Well, I guess he came first.
Well, yeah. But used to have massive powers. There was a dark age in which he was controlling a better part of the world until all of the different races, the dwarves, the humans, the elves, stood against him, and he was defeated, and he lost his ring of power.
He was defeated by Isildur.
Yeah, by Aragorn's great grandfather.
Yes. Who was Prince and now King of Gondor.
King of Gondor. So Sauron lost all of his power. He lost his empire, but he still lives in a sort of spiritual form.
Yeah,
he is also kind of like a Maiar. He's another tier down from, or he started as another tier down from what Gandalf is, and then
Sauron is a servant of
Morgoth.
People, this could get real dirty. Sauron is a servant of Morgoth, who was
a Valar who's corrupted.
Yes, a Valar, who is a Valar who started playing in dissonance, because in Tolkien's world, the whole universe was created through music.
Well, Morgoth started playing dissonance, which caused problems in the universe and corrupted him. But he also became obsessed with the gemstones, the Silmarils.
Yes.
And so he basically fell. Basically, it's a glorified fantasy version of the retelling of Lucifer's fall. Morgoth is essentially a Lucifer character. Morgoth is dispatched in the Silmarillion, but Sauron survives and becomes even more powerful. And if
you have any questions, please tweet at Stephen Colbert.
At any rate,
to our podcast.
At any rate, Sauron has control over these wraiths.
Were once men who had rings of power.
Blah blah blah. There are multiple rings of power. The one that Sauron had was the most top. You know all of this. You know this. Anyway,
Galadriel tells you this in the prologue of the movie.
At any rate, Aragorn helps them, because they have been pursued by the ring wraiths, since they left the Shire. And he helps them. They agree to go with him, and they head out for Rivendell, because Frodo thought he was going to meet Gandalf at Bree, pass the ring off, be done with it.
No.
Gandalf's not there. So they're like, okay, let's just go a little bit further. We'll go to Rivendell, which is an elven colony out in the woods.
And Sam is so excited to see the elves.
Yeah, Sam really wants to see
the elves. Hobbits are obsessed with elves for some reason.
Very weird. Very weird. At any rate, they set out for that. Along the way, they get cornered by the ring wraiths.
Weathercock happens, which, if you've seen the movie, you know how that works.
Yeah, Frodo gets injured, and an elf called Glorfindel comes and takes him to Rivendell, splits up the party. Sam is not happy about this.
No, Sam does not want Glorfindel to take him. However, he doesn't know that Glorfindel is also kind of a minor deity.
Yeah. Glorfindel is an ancient elf.
Yes.
Who
defeated a Balrog.
Who defeated a Balrog. He is going to take Frodo to the rest of the way to Rivendell. In the film, they have Arwen do this, which I think is nice. Tolkien, one of Tolkien's many issues is that there are 3 women who play any role whatsoever in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There are a few other women mentioned, but probably there's not more than like 10 women mentioned total as anything other than just somebody's wife.
Arwen and Galadriel.
Yeah. So women, the other women who are mentioned, at best, you get a Belladonna Took, who was like...
Luthien is mentioned.
But like for the most part, it's like this was his wife, and that's all you get about her.
Mhm.
So Tolkien definitely had that misogynistic. And this is the thing that has haunted high fantasy ever since, is that it has belonged to straight white men
Gatekeep.
who are notorious for gatekeeping.
Mhm.
So Tolkien, by not including women or any, he only focuses on races, as in elves, dwarves, orcs.
Which I would like to point out that the sci-fi fantasy genre was invented by Mary Shelley.
Mm-hmm.
So we
That's
should
true.
be gatekeeping you.
Nobody should be gatekeeping anybody.
Well, that's true. We should not.
But Tolkien never mentions people of color in his novels at all. And fantasy was fine to continue in that tradition for decades after the fact. We're only now starting to see people writing fantasy novels from the perspective of people of color and of women. And it's really unfortunate because, again, Mary Shelley is the first person who ever really wrote speculative sci-fi fantasy with Frankenstein. But Tolkien's influence, for better or worse, has kind of left a mark on it. So to me, even though Glorfindel is a very interesting character, I was glad to see Arwen take the role in the film.
Yeah, I enjoyed that Peter Jackson gave her a bigger role.
Yes. Because she is a very interesting and powerful elf.
She is.
But she doesn't really get much screen time in the novels other than as Aragorn's love interest.
Which is pretty much what you got in the movie, but she had a little bit more to do.
Yeah, well, she had the big rescue of Frodo, and she stares down the ring wraiths, which is no small feat.
No, definitely not.
Luckily, Gandalf is in Rivendell.
Yes, thankfully.
So
you Elrond.
Frodo, well, and so is Bilbo. Yes, Bilbo, who had vanished on his 111th birthday 17 years earlier, is
he wanted to go live
having a great time, just drinking, sleeping, and writing with the elves.
Man, I wish. Maybe then I could finish my novel.
At one point, he describes being there as like people just burst into songs at all hours that will go on for just decades. There's like people will just start a song and it'll go for hours, and everybody just listens. They just vibe. The elves are just vibing.
Dude, they're just chill. They're like, our time.
I wish I was just vibing.
To close. We don't like it, but we're just gonna sit here and chill and accept it, and we're gonna go off into the west at the end and to the undying lands and be okay.
It's interesting because the elves are simultaneously portrayed as the best race. Like, they're clearly Tolkien's favorite. The best race, the most interesting race, the race with the most historical significance. And they're also the ones who want to kick up their feet and do fuck all about the problems that Arda is dealing with now.
Well, it kind of makes sense because they're also old. You know, when you think of like your grandparents and you're scared about
my grandparents don't
like,
have the same body that I do.
That's true.
If I had my grandma's memories and history, but I still had my 30-year-old body, you can bet your ass I would still be out there doing stuff. The elves are just like, or we could sit here and write sad poetry and then leave. Like, they don't want to do shit, which is interesting because whenever the fellowship is formed, there's only one elf who joins them.
Well, like I said, their power is waning. They know that their time of power is coming to an end. They know it. But they all can tell. Instead of
choosing to use what little time they have left to help others, they fuck off and do nothing.
Are we talking about the elves or Threadwill?
We're talking about the elves. Okay. It's not just Thandril. I mean, Thandril is a problem, and that's why Legolas goes. But even Elrond is like, this ain't really our business.
Well, like, the elves don't really concern themselves with the troubles of men, but Elrond does because his brother ended up deciding to have a mortal life.
Not the troubles of men. They're the troubles of everybody. The entire planet, the entirety of Arda, of the entirety of Middle Earth is being by this. Not just humans, everybody. So being like, oh, we don't trouble ourselves with the problems of men. I'm like, fuck off, though.
I am not trying to argue with you. I'm just giving you the perspective from the book, but I totally am with you where it's just kind of like, you should care. Everybody should care. If this is affecting everybody, you're part of everybody, you should care.
Even if it's not affecting you, you should care. If other people are being hurt by injustices and you could be doing something to help,
You
and
should
you're
care.
just sitting on your ass writing poetry and playing your fucking lyre. Like, I think elves as a concept are very cool, but Tolkien's elves do not give a single solitary shit about anybody but themselves.
They're like, it'll work out. And they're just going to sit on their butt and do nothing. Most of them, anyway. Like, Galadriel's just like, even she is like, I'm going to fuck off and go into the West.
Mm-hmm.
You guys handle it. I'm done. And
yeah, it's not.
Elrond, it seems to be the only one who really kind of cares. And even then, it's not a lot.
Yeah, and Elrond only cares because he has personal stake because he was there with Isildur whenever he took the ring.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like,
and
maybe
also, he suspects his daughter is going to remain in Middle Earth because she's in love with a man.
Yes. So like Elrond is only doing anything because he didn't do anything earlier when he should have.
Exactly, and he feels guilty about it.
He should. If he had just shot Isildur with an arrow and he had fallen into
He's close enough, just shove him.
Push him in the volcano. And everybody's problem is fucking solved. Like, did you commit regicide? Yes. Can you probably get out of it? Probably. Yes. You're pretty wily. I think probably you'll be fine. Or you don't even have to get out of it because no one else was there to witness it. So just be like, yeah, the rocks under his feet just fell. I don't know, dude. Like, he went in the lava. I tried to grab him, but I wasn't fast enough.
He was
problem solved.
Ring in, and then the ring in its final grip had him jump in after it.
Yeah, it's just the elves. I'm not impressed with their attitudes. It's very, very. It's actually
they're very old, but also they're also kind of among that deity class where they're not really supposed to interfere.
Well, they're not deities.
No, they're not. They're a step below Gandalf.
At any rate, I think that it's interesting that the elves have this policy of self-isolation in a novel that was written by a man who was a veteran in World War One.
I wonder who had a policy of self-isolation in World War One. Weird.
My point being, Tolkien would have my head for accusing him of writing an allegory. But there's some certain allegorical elements to his novels.
Well, and as a writer, stuff shows up in your work that you did not intend to put there.
I saw a note today on Twitter that said Tolkien only cares about war as a backdrop for how much men can love each other, which I think is true. I think that the whole concept of war in Tolkien's novels is really just a backdrop for the relationships that the characters develop when they're trapped together in this kind of foxhole situation.
It is.
And how much they come to trust each other. And that's why the fellowship is so significant. There's these 9 people who become very, very reliant on each other. Yes, and it all falls apart when one person in that group isn't able to uphold the bond of integrity that they have between each other.
They choose to be loyal and they choose to be friends, and as soon as one person breaks that, it breaks everything.
Yes. So the fellowship is made up of Legolas, son of Sandril, who is an elf from Mirkwood. Legolas, notably, is one of the younger elves. Yes. And one of the only ones who has an attitude that's about helping everybody and not just like fucking off and writing poetry.
He's young and optimistic.
Yes.
Gimli, son of Gloin,
who is the son of one of Bilbo's. Yeah, one of Bilbo's old friends from The Hobbit, who he traveled with.
Imprisoned by Thranduil.
And then we've got Merry, Pippin, and Sam, who only get to go by virtue of refusing to go home.
Yes, and Elrond's like, he's like, I like the idea of sending Sam, who snuck into a secret meeting to make sure Frodo was going to be okay. That's kind of loyalty I can get behind. Merry and Pippin I don't know about, and Gandalf is like, they're loyal to Frodo. Don't try and stop them. Gandalf is going. Aragorn is going.
Aragorn is going, and then we have Boromir, son of Denethor, who is the current steward of Gondor. So Gondor, the kingdom of Gondor, has been kingless for a while. because
Yes.
Aragorn's father sucked off into exile before Aragorn was born.
Yes.
And so Aragorn has been living as a drifter in the woods and has not yet reclaimed the throne, even though it is rightfully his.
Yeah.
So Gondor is under the control of a steward, and his son, one of his two sons, the older of his two sons, Boromir, is the ninth person to join the group.
Yeah, and Gondor is across the river from Mordor, where Sauron has his seat of power. So Gondor has had a front row seat to the evil and the destruction that has been going on in the world. And Boromir is he's very adamant about the idea of action, about using
his first suggestion is to use the ring to fight Sauron, which makes sense on a very like straightforward logical level, but it doesn't take into account the corruption that the ring brings.
Yeah, Boromir sees the ring as a means to victory and as a means to protect his kingdom.
And the novel sets this up very nicely, that you know that something's going to go wrong with Boromir, because he's the only person in this meeting, in this secret council meeting, who is arguing against taking the ring to destroy it.
Yeah.
He's like, we should keep it, we should use it. And you immediately, as a reader, you clock onto that and you're like, this is going to go wrong. This is going to go south. And there's nothing anyone can do about it.
Yeah, but Boromir is a character, again, he has seen the destruction. He has seen his kingdom.
Right, Boromir's not a bad guy.
No,
he's trying to take care of his people. He's been thrust into a position of power. He's been pressured by his father to
bring the ring to Gondor.
To help his people.
You don't know this at the time, but Boromir is in a really tough position. And then also, too, at this meeting, it is discovered that, the guy who is actually supposed to be ruling Gondor is here?
And Boromir is not interested. Boromir's like, you're not my king. You'll never be my king. The ruling class, as far as I'm concerned, the ruling class abandoned Gondor.
Yeah.
You abandoned Gondor, so you have no right.
For our people. You have not.
So there's a lot of tension there right off the bat. Yeah. And when they set out, they're kind of slowly starting to get to know each other on the road.
Legolas and Gimli become fast friends.
Legolas
because dwarves and elves are not supposed to like each other.
Yeah, they get on like a house on fire, which is interesting. Which is interesting considering that that again, Legolas's father imprisoned Gimli's father.
Yes.
In his kingdom about 100 years previous. So that's interesting. They make their way up to the mountains, and they plan to cross over the mountains, but because of some bad snowstorms.
Yeah, bad snowstorms.
Because the mountain is magically evil. I don't know. Although in the movie,
it's Saruman, who has, God bless Christopher Lee, may he rest in peace. He has allied himself with Sauron. Saruman and Sauron. Good luck.
Yeah, I mean, Saruman was at one point, and Saruman is it's interesting because, again, if you've read the Silmarillion, you know that Sauron was essentially a kind of like a deity type character, like the Maiar, who was corrupted by Morgoth. And then Sauron goes on to corrupt Saruman, who is one of the Maiar, whose job is to protect Middle-earth. And he starts to, so he's very much like a reflection of Sauron in the Silmarillion.
Very much so, yes.
And
history repeats itself. So if you don't learn history, you don't know what has happened before. You don't see the pattern.
So Saruman, in the movie, Saruman does magic to make the mountain hate them. But in the book, the mountain is just evil.
Yeah.
And so there's all these like fucking snowstorms, and they can't travel, and the hobbits can't handle the cold.
So they just decide
to go through the mines.
That Tolkien does tell us what happens to Bill the Pony. I was concerned the first time I read this book.
Oh, yes.
Like, Bill's off just, like, eating grass somewhere. He's quite happy.
He's fine.
He's a happy pony.
So they go into these horrible, spooky mines to pass through underneath the mountain to get to the other side. And
pretty much follow the movie for a bit.
Yeah, that's where they lose Gandalf.
They
That's where they lose Gandalf.
lose Gandalf.
To the Balrog, which a Balrog is like a fire demon. Real nasty business. And the reason that the mountain, Moria used to be a dwarven mining town, but when they arrive, it's completely abandoned.
But from the Hobbit took care of it, and then the orcs and goblins took it over, and the Balrog and
the Balrog was really more of the problem because orcs and goblins, there always are orcs and goblins under the mountain, and they have to have fortifications.
Balrogs are literal demons.
But the Balrog had basically destroyed the encampment there, and it also takes Gandalf away from the party, which is unfortunate because he's their kind of leader.
Yeah,
which
he's
means
their leader.
that they're now without guidance.
He's the standard guide position.
The wise wizard.
Yes,
and once he's gone, most of the party is pretty content to have Aragorn take over.
Yeah.
But that tension between Boromir and Aragorn kind of rears its head again because Boromir still does not have any respect for Aragorn.
No.
And so they argue about where to go next.
Like, I'm 80-freaking-7. Chill, child.
So Boromir argues with them, but Aragorn decides to take them down into Lothlorien, which is another elven...
safe and rest and recuperate. Also, to Galadriel is his love interest's grandmother. So,
so they go into Lothlorien. They meet Galadriel. They kind of grieve for Gandalf while they're there. And Galadriel, again, is an elf who just wants to fuck off and let the humans deal with their own problems, which are everybody's problems, not just the humans' problems. So I don't know why.
Yeah.
But she at least offers them some insight into the situation, offers a little bit of future sight to them.
Yes, because she has the gift. She has her mirror, which lets her see things that have yet to come to pass. And Samwise Gamgee looks in it, and he sees basically the Shire on fire.
Yeah, the Shire being burned to the ground.
He worries, and he wants to run back home to check on things, but his loyalty to Frodo wins out, and he stays. And Frodo sees the eye.
Yeah, Frodo sees the Eye of Sauron. Frodo at this point is starting. It's interesting because, again, he's at home for 17 years.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really...
And he just leaves something on his mantelpiece, and he doesn't touch it.
But once he starts carrying it, he starts noticing he has weird dreams. Mm-hmm. His temperament is more mercurial. There is a physical weight to it that gets heavier the closer they get to Mordor. And so at this point, he's starting to be kind of haunted by this ring. And he offers it to Galadriel, which in the film gives us one of the most terrifying moments in the whole movie.
Yes.
Which, if you've seen it, you know she goes all negative space.
Yeah.
And it's very intense. But she does not take it. She considers this offering a test which she has passed. And she sends them on their way with many gifts and goodwill. But again, doesn't send anyone with them, doesn't offer any actual physical help.
One of my favorite things is when they do go off, Gimli, who is a dwarf, which is like the race that elves are supposed to like dislike and not get along with, asks for like one strand of her hair, and he gives her 3. And if you've read the Silmarillion, you know that is a big screaming deal.
Yeah.
Because somebody destroyed an entire freaking city over Galadriel's hair.
Yes. So, yeah, the dwarves and the elves have an ongoing disagreement. This is another case in which we see Tolkien being racially negative. Dwarves, kind of in the same way that Rowling handles goblins, Tolkien definitely has some anti-Semitic attitudes in the way that he presents dwarves. They are obsessed with money. They are industrious and hardworking, and they don't want outsiders to have anything to do with them. and it's kind of negative traits that have been associated with Jewish people. Yeah. And it's like, it's just kind of unfortunate that we see this from Tolkien, especially considering that The Hobbit came out in 1937. It's just like, not really digging the anti-Semitism there, buddy.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that has been a recurrent problem even to this day. And I'm like, I don't get it, personally. I mean,
yeah.
But I'm like, just leave it alone. Who cares?
Yeah. So Gimli, the dwarves in The Hobbit have these attitudes, but since they are part of the group that is with the protagonist, you don't see it quite so blatantly. You see it in the books and almost even more in the film with the way that Gimli interacts with some elves early on, of this just kind of negative attitude towards the dwarves and a lot of unfortunate implications.
That there is a long history of there's a lot of bad blood between elves and dwarves. The thing that I like in the movie, especially with Gimli and Legolas, is that both of them overcome their prejudice to become very, very, very good friends.
They're dating.
They overcome their prejudice to
get married.
I mean, Legolas builds a boat and sneaks a dwarf into the Undying Lands. I can't argue with you.
They're married.
They're married.
They're gay married.
They're married. So they overcome their prejudice.
Come into my inbox if you want to fight with me about it. I dare you.
I mean, like, I would sneak my husband into the Undying Lands. So yeah, let's do it. Come, you know what? Yeah, take a stand. Come fight me too. Fight me.
They're married. They're married.
They're married. So they both overcome prejudices. They overcome their prejudices of each other to get gay married.
Yes, no, they do, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Tolkien codes dwarves in general as Jewish with negative anti-Semitic.
I'm so sick and tired of fantasy novels coding dwarves as a hated religion.
There just needs to be a reckoning about identifying an entire race as like that. The problem with this is that it's intrinsic to fantasy. Like you can't really step away from it. The thing that we need to talk about is you can't just be like, well, dwarves are generally like this and orcs are generally like this. That entire premise is wrong and it shouldn't be used. Like even if what you're saying they are is not negative, you're still assigning traits by a race instead of by an individual's action.
Yeah.
And I understand that's a little bit too nuanced for a lot of fantasy writing, especially fantasy writing before people actually were actively thinking about and criticizing these things. But I think it's important for us to call it out when we see it, because otherwise it's just going to be perpetuated onwards instead of changed going forward.
Authors always take, even if it's something they subconsciously believe, it is going to end up in their work, whether they mean it to or not.
And again, this conversation wasn't being had in Tolkien's day.
No, it wasn't.
I don't excuse him because the conversation wasn't being had. I still appreciate his novels. I still like his work.
Yeah.
But Tolkien was a racist.
I wonder if Tolkien knew he was creating a genre of literature when he wrote this book.
That's something you have to wonder about. When anytime you're talking about anything relatively historical, you have to wonder how aware of what they were doing people are.
But because I mean, if you talk to somebody like Lin-Manuel Miranda, he had no idea when he was writing Hamilton that it was going to be such a sensation that it was. He had no idea. And he's just like, I was just writing something that I was passionate about, and I just hoped other people enjoyed it. I had no idea it was going to turn out to be huge.
Yeah, that's a certain thing that you can't really ever know. Yeah. And like, I don't necessarily fault Tolkien or expect him to know, but I just think that we collectively have to be aware that Tolkien's racism has been
It's affected
it's a wide scale. Yeah, it's wide scale.
Every fantasy book that has come after, because Tolkien inventing this genre of high fantasy, everybody kind of follows his lead. And so things that we might find as unconscious in the book are unconsciously carried over until we are made conscious of it.
Until someone decides to question it, which is why it's so important to have these conversations and question it, because it's like, if no one ever questions it, then we never get anywhere. But we've gotten very, very off track.
So sidetracked.
After Lothlorien, Boromir attacks Frodo.
Basically, he wants to take the ring. Basically, the power of the ring seduces him, and he wants to take the ring from Frodo because he wants to take it to his city, Minas Tirith, to protect it, to protect his country.
How much of Boromir wanting to take the ring to Minas Tirith do you think is him wanting to protect his people, and how much of it do you think is him wanting to please his father?
Yes. 50-50. I would go 50-50, especially knowing what I know about Denethor.
Yeah. So Boromir attacks Frodo. The Fellowship is broken. They end up splitting off. And this is another thing that I don't think I've seen in literature pre-Tolkien that we'll start to see in the later books, is that we have multiple narrative storylines with separate protagonists happening simultaneously. And they all eventually will converge.
Yes. A modern fantasy author who does this all the time is JRR Martin.
Yes.
All the time.
But again, probably got it from Tolkien.
Yeah, probably got it from Tolkien.
But yeah, so the Fellowship is split off into Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn are a group. Pippin and Merry have been kidnapped by orcs, and so the three of them decide to chase after.
In the book, Boromir goes with Merry and Pippin, and Legolas and Gimli and Aragorn all split up because Frodo has the ring on. He's gone to search. So Legolas and Gimli go off. Aragorn and Sam go off.
Right. No, I'm talking about the bigger split.
Oh yeah, the bigger split.
I'm not talking about nuance. I'm like, we've been on here for 90 minutes. Nuance is out the window.
With the three hunters, which is Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli,
tracking the orcs who have kidnapped Pippin and Merry.
Boromir has gone off in another direction to find Pippin and Merry. Have been kidnapped by orcs, and Sam realizes Frodo is going off on his own and goes off to get Frodo. And this book literally ends with Sam and Frodo going off on their own. Boromir does not die until the first chapter of Two Towers.
He doesn't die until the first chapter of the Two Towers. But
at this
point, Tolkien wrote this as one book.
Yeah, at this point, the narrative split.
Yeah, Tolkien wrote this as one book. And so the narrative split is not quite so jarring, but in the film, they had to have a climax. And so Boromir's death, the sacrifice and death, had to happen at the end of the first film.
Yes.
To be cohesive as a film. But yeah, in the books, he does not die. Well, he technically, timeline-wise, probably dies in the Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah.
But like, we aren't aware of his death.
Yeah, we aren't aware of it.
Until the beginning of Two Towers.
Yeah, and so Frodo and Sam going across the river to Mordor is the end of this book. So the Fellowship has dissolved, it's split up, and Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli go off to try and save Merry and Pippin, and that is one narrative story arc that we follow through the Two Towers and Return of the King. And then the other story arc is Sam and Frodo trying to destroy the ring.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak ending.
It is. It's a bleak ending, but it wasn't meant to be an ending.
Right, exactly. Tolkien wrote these as a single novel.
Yeah.
And so yeah, he didn't really intend for it to end here, but his publishers were like, that's too long, no one's going to want to read that. We don't know if everybody it's going to be successful.
Now there are people who publish this in one giant novel. So, times of
you haven't seen mine, because mine is a paperback that's about this thick, and it's so old, and I've dropped it so many times that the binding is no longer attached, and it has a big rubber band around the middle of it.
Like the original paperback versions I had originally were destroyed when I read them, because
listen, my copy has blood and blood. It has there's one chapter that's just got mud splattered across the page because I dropped it in a puddle. There's another chapter that has blood drops on it because I paper cut my finger and didn't realize it and kept reading for 3 pages before I realized I was bleeding. This book looks like it's been through World War I. It's a goddamn mess.
My original copy, since the movies were about to come out, they were like, and I used my own money to buy them. They were like the cheapo paperback versions with the movie covers, which I detest when books do that. And since I was reading them in middle school, I would read them in between class or like when I didn't have homework or something like that. So they were like in my backpack. So they got destroyed. So for our 1-year wedding anniversary, my husband got me the really nice paperback version or the hardback version with the nice dust cover. And you take the dust cover off and we have like the cool, pretty book that's just like so lovely.
All right. So that's the Fellowship of the Ring. I feel like that was a very all over the place episode. It's a quarantine. I can do what I want. My brain hurts. Don't expect me to be narratively coherent. Yeah. But I feel like there was some interesting conversation there. How many bottles would you give Fellowship of the Ring?
I would say Fellowship of the Ring with, I know we talked a lot about kind of the problems of this book and the story and the writing, but like the overpowering arc of this book is about loyalty and friendship and love and humility. With those kind of themes, especially with Frodo being so humble that like the ring it's not really starting to take a huge effect on him yet. And Merry and Pippin and Sam's loyalty to Frodo because they love him. And those themes of love and friendship being able to overpower evil, I would probably give it a 3.75. Because like I said, I've read this book I don't know how many times.
Yeah.
It's definitely one I revisit a lot.
This is not my favorite. The Return of the King is my favorite of the series.
Yes.
But this is my second favorite, and I would give it 4 bottles, I say, for the same reasons. And just for the sheer virtue of we wouldn't have the genre without it.
Exactly.
You can expect more from us in August. Hopefully in August we'll be able to do 2 traditional episodes again.
Thank you for
bearing with us. Obviously, we needed a little bit of a mental health break. You can look for A Blade So Black. That will be one of them for sure. I think we've been talking about it for a long time, and I think after this conversation, we really need to get some fantasy from an author of color in here.
That would be really
so that'll be one of ours for next month. Other one, check out our Twitter or our Facebook to find out more information about once we've made a decision. In the meantime, we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we have a website, litliteraturePodcast.com.
Yes, and if you're feeling exceptionally generous and you're able to in these times of turmoil, we do have a Patreon. It is patreon.com/theslit. If you donate to even just the lowest tier, you get every blooper reel we have ever done, which if you like last month's episode, you get a lot of those. Even if you can just tell somebody about our podcast and get them to listen to us, that would be greatly appreciated. Casey just got married. I have 6-month-old babies. They're half a year old. I can't do it. So anything you guys feel like you can give, we really appreciate it, even if it's just word of mouth.
Yes. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you next time.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. For more information, visit us at litliteraturePodcast.com or check out our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. And remember, too much work and no vacation deserves at least a small libation. Cheers!